What does radical faith really look like? Well, you take a 75-year-old man who has a barren wife. He has no Bible. He has no experience with God. And in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, God speaks to Abraham from the heavens and says to him that he will be the father of many nations, that God is going to bless him, that God is going to increase his numbers. Well, 3 chapters later and a number of years go by and nothing's happened. Still no children, still no nation, still none of the blessing. And God talks to him again and says, I'm going to greatly increase your number. I'm going to do all these amazing things for you. Bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. And it says in chapter 15 of Genesis that Abraham believed God and God credited to him as righteousness. And after that statement, God tells Abraham to kill some animals, to make an idol, and Abraham falls into a deep sleep. And in the sleep, he has a vision of a fire pot representing God going down between the pieces. And the message that God gives to Abraham is one deeply and firmly embedded in Abraham's culture. They actually talk about cutting a covenant because they would cut animals, separate the two halves, make an idol, and the two parties making an agreement, a covenant, a contract, if you will, would walk down between the pieces. And the message that was embedded in their memory was, if we don't keep our end of the deal, so be it to us like has happened to these animals. Both parties would go down. In Abram's vision, only God goes between the pieces. God's message to him is, you have believed me, you have trusted me, and I am reaffirming to you that I will do what I promised, and if I do not, so be it to me like has happened to these animals. Well, several chapters later, in chapter 17, Abraham still doesn't have a son. He's many, many more years. I think he's 90 years old at this point in time. He's waited for 15 years for this. His wife is no more fertile than she was in her 60s. And God reaffirms his covenant promises and blessings to him once more. And it says in Genesis 17 that Abraham laughed about this. And God says, oh, you're going to laugh, aren't you? Why don't you name the boy? He laughs, Isaac. So Sarah gets wind of this, and when the 3 visitors come, and she laughs about it. And because they just can't believe their ears. Yes, they do believe. They have faith and trust. It's just so crazy how God works. And they have full-on trust that this is going to happen. Well, when you talk about radical faith, or you talk about next level faith, what you're really talking about is how God starts with where we are and begins giving us experiences that build our trust in him, that then build our faith and our action, moving closer and closer to God. So by the time you hit Genesis 22, you have God who has promised this son, who Sarah has now given birth to. He's now aged a bit. And God now tells him in Genesis 22:1, take that son, that one and only son, and go with him to the place I will show you. It sounds an awful lot like Genesis 12:1, where God said almost the exact same thing to him, only he didn't have Isaac yet. And he says, take him to Moriah. I will show you the place. If you look up Moriah, there's only 2 instances of this. Genesis 22 here, and 2 Chronicles 3:1, where it says that is the location where Solomon, hundreds of years later, many, many generations down the same family tree of Isaac, Solomon builds the temple where many lambs will be sacrificed, where many, many burnt offerings will be made on that very mountain. So God tells Abraham in Genesis 22:1 to sacrifice this son as a burnt offering to give him fully to God. The question is, will Abraham fear the Lord? Will Abraham withhold anything from God? Or will Abraham trust God all the way? Will Abraham trust the God who walked between the pieces to do what he said he was going to do? So it says, not Abraham woke up and bargained with the Lord. Not that Abraham even talked with Sarah necessarily, although he may have done that. Genesis 22:2, very next verse, Abraham got up early the next morning, took his servants, took his son, took the fire, took the wood, and they went on their way to the place God would show them. They went for 3 days. It was on the 3rd day that they saw it. If there's not a Jesus reference in this story, that's the one. 3 days later, they found the spot where resurrections would take place. Not that Isaac would actually die and be raised to dead, but you'll see here in a moment exactly why the 3rd day matters. So Abraham says to his servants, hey, just stay here. Me and the boy are going to go up on the mountain, and in a little while, we will come back and meet you. So Abraham and Isaac are walking up the mountain. Isaac's like, hey, Dad, we got everything else, but where is the lamb that we're going to offer? And Abraham says, the Lord will provide. They go on to the place God shows them. Abraham grabs Isaac, binds him up, and in Jewish literature, this is known as the Akedah, the binding. Not the loosing, but the binding. And Abraham binds him up, and he's about to kill him when the angel speaks from heaven. Only 2 times this happened. Genesis 21 toward Hagar, toward Ishmael, and now toward Isaac, when an angel doesn't just come and talk to them, it speaks to them from heaven. 2 instances, these 2 chapters, and he says, don't lay a hand on the boy. The angel says, I can see that you fear the Lord and that you have not withheld anything from God. What does it look like to trust God completely? And how does Abraham go through with this amazing act of faith? The book of Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19 gives us some details about this. It says this about Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Sounds a lot like Jesus, John 3:16. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did. There's your 3rd day. Okay? So think about this. Let's put the pieces together here. Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations. It's going to come through Isaac. I can swear it by my very life. This is going to happen. Abraham believes God, credited to him his righteousness. They have the son. He is growing up. And then God says, offer him to me. Do not withhold him from me, but offer him to me as a burnt offering to the Lord. All of a sudden, Abraham has to reconcile 2 things. The promises he's sure of from God, and kill the son through whom all the promises come. So Abraham has to make a path in his own mind between what God promised and what he's telling him to do. And the only way to reconcile that, yes, both of these things will happen, is resurrection. With no Bible, with no examples of ever having witnessed this probably in his entire life, he reasons that even God can raise the dead. That's how much Abraham trusts God. So the question for us is this: how do we get to next level faith? It's going to require testing. It's going to require being challenged. Oftentimes when we get tested or challenged, we say, why is God doing this to me? Well, the answer may be to grow and build your faith. Or the answer may be God isn't doing this to you, but it's something that can build and grow your faith, to get you to next level faith, to get you to a radical trust and obedience of faith to God that fears the Lord and does not withhold anything from him. This angel says to him from the heavens, I see now that you fear God and that you have not withheld anything from him. So the question for us is, are we bound up with things, the binding, the akadah? Are we bound up with things that we do not see how to be released from? That we do not trust God's providence or power in releasing us from the things that bind us? We have no way of seeing the ram in the thicket because we are so caught up in our own drama, in our own mess, our own chaos, that we don't see how God is doing much at all when God is actually doing everything. He's doing so much. And we have to keep our eyes out to see. But first we have to fear the Lord, and we have to not withhold anything from him. If you are in a situation in life that calls for radical faith, my plea to you and my plea to myself is take the next faithful step and then see what God does. So often we're waiting to see God move before we move. But sometimes God waits for us to make the first move before he then shows us what he is doing. He wants to see our faith. Now, we could say, well, God is omniscient. God knows everything. He knows the end from the beginning, and he knew exactly how Abraham would respond. Fair enough. But this testing is not for God. This testing is for Abraham. If you want to get the next level faith, you're going to go through progressively more difficult things that you are going to enter in through complete trust in the Lord, and then you're going to get to see how God acts and works on your behalf to bring about things that you could never have imagined and to do things that seemed impossible to you but were completely possible with God. Radical faith can unlock the movement of God. And in Hebrew, the words for faith really are action words. These are not just passive believing words. What does your faith look like? It means you are being obedient to what God has called you to do. That is faithful faith. If there is anything you are going through that it looks like there is no right conclusion, no right path through it, just trust that God is working on your behalf. Take the next faithful step. That's how radical faith is built. You do the things God asks you to do, and then you watch and see what God does. If you are bound up in drama, if you are bound up in a mess, if you are bound up with addiction, you're bound up with things you do not know how to handle, then you're going to have to not withhold that from God. When it comes to addictions, we feel very controlled by those things, but at the end of the day, we are holding on to those things for reasons because we have not given those things up to God or to watch God handle, because we have become so comfortable with those things that we prefer often to hold on to them rather than to give them to God and then do the hard work of transformation. And as we withhold those things from God and we do not fear the Lord as we should, we are in a bound state of being. If you do not fear the Lord and you are withholding things from God, you will get bound up. God will keep you from moving forward. I'm telling you, He will discipline you. He will block your way. He will make sure that you are stuck until you finally turn it over to Him. So if you're feeling stuck, then maybe part of it is to say, maybe my faith is not radical enough for me to give to God all that He's given me because I'm being bound up. I was in a situation last couple weeks where I was feeling completely bound up. I felt called to do some training in some areas that I really need to train people in and some discipling and reproducible church planting. I had been given information on how to go about doing this. I'd been trained in how to do this, but I've never done it. And so I kept feeling as I was working through it, just so bound up. And so it finally came to me, Matt, after studying Abraham these last few weeks, you have to take the next faithful step. And so I made the calls. I talked to the people who I wanted to invite to this. They accepted the invitation. And I said, okay, Matt, now you're really on the hook. You got to set the date. We set the date. Begin working through the material. What's it going to look like? How's the training going to go? What do they really need? How's it really going to work? I began laying all that. And I just felt so bound up. Like I just felt like there was not a path through it. And I'm just like, okay, God, just help me with this. I don't know how to do this well. I've never done this before. And I got an email 2 weeks ago from a man I had never heard of. And he emailed me and he said, hey, I really want to talk about what you're doing. I think I could be helpful. And here I am just trying to just take the next one faithful step, call the people, make the invite, set the date, work on the material. I feel so bound up. I feel so inadequate. And it just feels like in the realm of impossibility. And he literally says, I've done this before. I've been doing it for 7 years. I've reproduced 100 house churches. And what I have is yours, completely open-handed. Here, let me send you some information on how to go about this training. I was like, oh my goodness, Lord, you are so faithful. There's the ram in the thicket. There's the ram. I feel so bound up and there's the ram in the thicket. But first you got to raise the knife. First you got to be willing to go through with it and just say, okay, God, I'm just going to trust you. I'm going to trust you to provide. I'm going to trust you to show the way. You know what's best. And you're going to have to start plunging that knife before God says, hey, don't lay a hand on the boy. I got this taken care of. You don't have to be so bound up by this. I have a path. And when you see God give you the path, the conviction level on that decision and path and plan is 1,000 times greater than when you feel like you have it all on your own and you go through life by your own strength and you don't have to trust on God for very much and you skate through life without really needing a whole lot of faith. Let's move to next level faith. And it may be your faith is just like Jesus said, the size of a mustard seed, but even that is enough to do great things in God's hands. Maybe your faith is great. Just keep doing the next small, even tiny, faithful thing you can do and watch what God does next. If you're feeling bound up, this may explain why. And if you have a chance to watch a few more videos, I'd love for you to do that. I appreciate you watching this. Take care. We'll see you soon.